Bismillah. Dory Carroll had never known fear before, or she had experienced the normal anxieties inherent in the growing up process. She had felt that scalp-tingling tip of anxiety a woman feels when she is walking to her car parked in an inlet parking lot on a dark night. She did had her share of butterflies in the stomach before presenting courtroom arguments, but the fear lurking inside Dory Carroll now was new to her, a hostile invader that permeated her mind and colored her thoughts. It was not fear of carrying a shield. She was a healthy woman, basically fit, and shield-bearing was a perfectly natural function of a woman's body. What scared Dory was change over which she had no control. Up to the moment that she had sat opposite her doctor and been told she was pregnant, all the change in Dory's life had been growth. She had progressed from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to adulthood, from high school to college, from law school to law practice. All those changes had been positive ones, predictable ones, changes in which she had had some freedom of choice. She had selected her courses in high school, her major in college, the type of practice she wanted. And then there was Scott. She had recognized almost immediately that he was the perfect man for her. Eagerly she had let him into her life. Blissfully she had surrendered her heart to him. From the very beginning they had agreed that what they had was special, that their relationship did not have to follow the traditional path to marriage, children, and suburbia. They had worked out the patterns that allowed their love to flourish despite the distance between them and the limited time they could spend together. They were in tacit agreement that their relationship was as close to perfect as a relationship could be. It worked, so there was no need to change it. But now, because of the life ticket in her womb, everything was going to change. Her life, his life, quite possibly their love. No, she tapped frantically, not their love, not the way they felt about each other. Nothing could change that. But as sure as Dory was that their love was sound, she was equally as sure that their relationship was in trouble. Love was the basic foundation, the solid slab upon which a relationship was built. But structure and design were important too, and from the first theirs had been an unconventional, experimental design. They were individual towers that met at specific intervals, not a single structure. Now they were facing a fierce storm of change, and who could say whether the experimental design could stand up under the strain? The fact that it might not, that the relationship might deteriorate under the pressure of an unplanned pregnancy terrified her. She might lose Scott. The very prospect of it, the horrible, menacing prospect, chilled her to the bone. She literally quaked in fear when she let herself think of it. Even now, when she had her body leaned against his and his arms were wrapped around her, that fear crept along her spine. Scott's voice, explosive with incredulity, tore throat. As a sheltered silence pregnant. Unable to speak, she nodded her head, knowing he would feel the movement against his arm. Abruptly his arms were withdrawn and her head landed on the pillow with an ungracious thunk. Seconds later, light from the bedside lamp flooded over her face, making her feel like a prisoner about to be interrogated, under one of those harsh hanging lamps with a metal shade. Scott had hitched himself into a half-sitting position with his weight resting on his elbow. His face hovered inches above hers. Righteous indignation marked each of his features. His thick, dark hair was massed in incongruous contrast with his outraged inquisitor expression. For God's sake, Dory, pregnant how? If it had not been so serious a situation, she might have answered him with a smart crack, a joke. He was so indignant, so outraged, so typically male. But the situation was serious, and scarcely more than a week earlier, Dory had sat opposite her doctor with close to the same expression on her face and asked exactly the same question, how? Her doctor, with clinical detachment and wry humor, had replied, the same way it's been happening since Adam and Eve set the precedent in the Garden of Eden. Dory did not have the luxuries of clinical detachment and wry humor. She said simply, it just happened. It's impossible, Scott said. We're always careful with Dolly. No method is 100% fail-safe, Scott, even when you are careful. Scott collapsed onto his back and let out a ragged, belabored sigh. I can't believe this. Softly, I could not, either at first. There was a silence, a long, awkward, strained silence that hankered between the parallel lines of their bodies on the mattress. I don't suppose there could not be a mistake, a mix-up. No mix-up, no mistake. Another silence, then Scott posed the question. What are we going to do about it? Dory swallowed, trying in vain to get rid of the lump that had formed in her throat. The doctor and I talked, she said. And then her voice did crack as the first tears spilled over her cheeks. I can't do something about it, Scott. The doctor was so blasé when he told me about a clinic where, but it's a human being, Scott, or it will be. I could not hurt it. I couldn't just get rid of it like an inconvenience. Again that charged silence settled between them, an invisible enemy. Finally Scott said, I'm glad when you said that just now I was relieved. He waited too long to ask, do you want to get married? Disappointment hit Dory with the force of an anvil dropped on her chest. He had hesitated and the obligation was audible in his voice. It took several deep breaths to make her own voice sound calm. No, Dory, he said, but she forestalled him. If she let him argue, let him offer to do the right thing, she might let herself be convinced that it really was the right thing to do. Scott, the only valid reason for two people to get married is because they want to get married, not because of some outdated code of ethics. But I can deal with that, Scott. I had been an hypocrite if I aimed this pregnancy at your head like an old-fashioned shotgun. I'm not some virgin you seduced in the high loft. I am mature, independent woman who entered into a sexual relationship wholeheartedly. You have made it clear from the beginning how you feel about marriage, and I have accepted it. In fact, I have shared the same feelings. It would be wrong, disastrous for us to start pretending to want what we have never wanted before. Another pause, a small sigh. Maybe you are right. Dory closed her eyes against the tears burning them. She had heard the relief in his voice. God help her. She could feel the relief in his body, feel it even though they weren't touching. She sensed it with an intuition that did not require touch. She despised Scott for that relief, and no, she wasn't being fair. He had not had time to think about a baby, to adapt his thinking to include the innovated event. Scott was not a family man. He had never pretended to be. After the debacle his parents had made of their various marriages, he was ultra shy, and justifiably so. She could hardly expect him to assimilate the news of his impending fatherhood in something under 5 minutes. Pregnancy must have a middling effect on the brain, she thought. Sometime in the past week, perhaps when she began to think of the baby as a human being instead of an error, a fantasy had formed in her mind. In the fantasy, Scott learned about the baby and miraculously discovered he was delighted. How could she have been so blind, so stupid, so naive? Of course Scott was not delighted. Of course he did not suddenly want to settle down not only to marriage but to parenthood, all in one fell swoop. You don't turn a hardcore bachelor into doting family man by announcing, "Surprise, I'm pregnant." If Scott was feeling anything right now beyond shock, it was probably cornered. He would be feeling pathetically snared, like a coyote with his leg in the jaws of a steel trap. She wanted to say something to comfort him, assure him, but she did not know what to say. She wanted to touch him, but suddenly she didn't know how. "Dory, you know that I care about you, don't you?" "Scott, yes, of course I know that." He reached for her hand and threaded his fingers through hers. "I'm glad you know." A silent eternity followed before they fell asleep. In his sleep, Scott turned to Dory, embracing her with his arms and legs. In her sleep, Dory cuddled against Scott, resting her head on his chest. Upon awakening, Dory carefully extricated herself from his grasp. No easy matter with the sleeping male clutching her possessively, clinging to her when she tried to move. Moments later, the emptiness of the bed roused Scott. In the twilight of half-sleep, he recognized the softness of Dory's bed, smelled the faint remnant of her perfume that clung to the bedding. He reached for her and found only an empty, lingering warmth under the sheets where she should be. A vague unease hovered over his semi-wakefulness. Awestruck, he had awakened in the middle of a nightmare that had left him on the edge of alarm. Slowly, as he came more fully awake, memories of the night before flooded back to him. Reality was worse than a nightmare, less escapable. Scott groaned into his pillow. What a mess! He had not been consciously aware of the water running in the shower, but he noted the exact moment the pipes rattled in protest to being turned off. Lying still as death, he listened to the muffled sounds of Dory drying herself, dressing, toweling her hair. He pretended to be asleep when she tiptoed through the bedroom. He needed time, a few minutes at least, to mull over the bombshell she had dropped last night. It was not until he smelled brewing coffee and heard cooking sounds coming from the kitchen that he dragged himself out of bed and lumbered to the bathroom. As he prepared to shave, he peered with self-loathing at the image in the mirror. It was a pleasant enough image, a conventionally handsome face. His hair was still thick and dark despite the treacherous strands of grey he discovered now and then. No, he had no complaint with the face or the hair. It was the man inside he loathed, the coward, The man who was less honorable than Scott Rowland, Jr. was supposed to be. He loved Dory. He had swear it on a stack of Bibles in any courtroom in the world. But marriage, a baby, that was not the way it was supposed to be. At least not for a very long time. Not until they were ready, if they ever were. They had agreed no legal pieces of paper, no pressure, no chains, no nagging, no regrets, no babies. Yet it had happened. Scott frowned mightily. Dory pregnant, the very thought of it made his stomach queasy. For a moment after he lettered his face, he started at the ridiculous piece of plastic he had taken from the drawer Dory kept stocked with toilet articles from him and wondered if it was possible to slit one's throat with a disposable bic. Not that he would. He was not feeling like much of a man, but he was not suicidal, only ashamed of himself. A woman like Dory? What kind of man would not want to marry a woman like Dory after getting her pregnant? A man who did not want to get married at all to anyone that would. Dory knew how he felt about marriage. She understood she did not want to get married either. Had not she said last night that it would be a mistake? Maybe it would be all right after all. Sure, he thought, with the first deliberate swipe of the razor. It would be all right, and the sun would rise in the west tomorrow morning, right after the crow jumped over the moon.